We are in section 2, the value streams and processes dimension of the relationship management practice. This section is rather long, just like section 1, because in the exam you will have 5 questions of the 20 from this section. It'll be a mix of Bloom's level 2 and Bloom's level 3 questions, meaning understanding and application questions. The process questions would be understanding type, and the value stream questions would be the application type. So together, section 1, the key concepts, and this section 2, value streams and processes, make up 10 of the 20 questions in the exam. We will be looking into the processes of the practice, specifically the inputs, outputs, and activities of each process, and also go into the value stream concept, specifically understanding where relationship management contributes to the organization's value streams. There are 2 processes in this practice. One, managing a common approach to relationships, and managing relationships journeys. If you notice, the first process is very similar to the practice success factor. However, we will see how that PSF is working as a process here. The second one, managing relationship journeys, is somewhat similar to the second and third practice success factors, the internal relationships and the external relationships to be managed effectively. However, the process name here is managing relationship journeys through various steps. We begin with the first one, the managing a common approach to relationships. So, which means this is about creating an approach, the relationship models. So this is focused on defining, agreeing, and promoting a common organization-wide approach to relationship between various stakeholders. In the exam, you may have questions around the inputs, outputs, or activities of each of these processes. And therefore, you need to be conversant with having to remember and understand what these are. Let's look at the outputs first, because it's the approach process. Therefore, the outputs would be mainly the principles of relationships, the relationship models, and therefore, we also have the others, such as the stakeholder maps that we learned earlier. There will be a culture analysis report, strategic requirements. Then we have the planning, training, and awareness material so that people can be made aware about the relationship approach and models. And then there's a relationships review report periodically, and then certain improvement initiatives for the approach and the models. The inputs here would be the organization strategy, because that would define or would be a key factor determining the approach and the models. Then we have the assessment of the organization's culture and relationship behavior patterns, which also becomes a key input to decide on the approach and the models. Then we also need the stakeholder information, and then the relationship improvement opportunities, which can help in improving the approaches or the models or both. So we have 5 steps here in sequence. First is to analyze the organization culture, strategy, and stakeholders. Second, to develop and agree principles of relationships based on this analysis in the first step. Then once the principles are done, then develop and agree relationship models for key stakeholder groups. And then the next is to embed effective behavior patterns into daily work interactions based on those models and approach. And finally, review and adjust the relationship approach and models periodically or based on events. This is the workflow diagram. The notation here used is called the business process management notations. We don't have to be conversant with those notations. However, these symbols, for example, the inputs have 2 symbols here for the starting activity. And the first one is the changes in organizations that can trigger this process, or it could be a periodic review that can trigger this process as well. Now, therefore, that symbol, we see that rectangular symbol with lines inside it, is basically a condition that can trigger this process. So for example, change in organization can trigger this process. The below one, periodic review, the timer means this is a regular interval-based triggering of this process. So we can see the same 5 activities that we saw in the table earlier. The first step is to analyze the organization's culture, strategy, and stakeholders. That would yield the stakeholder maps, culture analysis report, and the strategic requirements. Then the strategic requirements are for the relationship management practice. Then the second one is to develop and agree the key principles of relationships, meaning the approach. And therefore, the output here is the principles of relationships supporting the strategy. Now, in the previous slide, we looked at the outputs of the entire process. Here we are seeing the outputs from each of these steps. And then the third one is to develop and agree the relationship models for key stakeholder groups. So we have the relationship models as an output from that activity. Then the next is to embed effective behavior patterns into daily work interactions. So we will have the plans, training and awareness materials for embedding those behaviors. And then lastly, we have review and adjust the relationships approach and models from time to time, where we will have the review report and the improvement initiatives. We will now get into the details of each of these activities. So now we see a little more information. The first one, the activity is to analyze the organization's culture, strategy, and stakeholders. This is where the leaders of the organization, and maybe sometimes they might bring on board external consultants to do this analysis. They will analyze the organization's culture and see whether it supports the strategy or not. They will also analyze the key internal and external stakeholders that they have to deal with. And the resulting analysis reports and stakeholder maps would be discussed with the wider management team to validate the results and raise awareness of the initiative. The initiative meaning to create an approach to relationship management. Then the next step is to go into the approach. So develop and agree the key principles of relationships. Again, the same leaders and managers supported by external consultants, if needed, they would develop and agree the key principles of the relationships with internal, external stakeholders. And these are the key characteristics of relationships with key stakeholder groups, which we saw earlier. Then develop and agree relationship models for key stakeholder groups. Here, for every stakeholder group, a relationship model is developed and agreed. And the model includes the level of communality, relationship journey steps, key activities, responsibilities, risks, opportunities of every step of the journey, recommended behavior patterns. Then the effective behavior patterns are embedded into the daily work interactions of the various employees and other stakeholders, which means the agreed principles and models need to be communicated and discussed across the organization. Depending on the model, there can be some formal training, such as training for how to have relationships with customers, users, media, auditors, and so on. Or it can be woven into the wider cultural awareness and development programs of the company for the internal relationships in particular. This is where other practices are also involved, depending on the relationship model being promoted. And those practices would be the workforce and talent management, organizational change management, strategy management, service desk, service level management, and supplier management. Then lastly, to review and adjust relationships approach and models periodically, wherein the leaders and managers monitor and review the adoption and effectiveness of the agreed principles and models of the relationships. This can be done event-based. For example, if there are relationship incidents, conflicts, crisis, or it could be interval-based, usually annually or at least, if not half-yearly, and the resulting findings and initiatives are used as input for continual improvement.